To the flashing cameras of the Lagos press, their marriage was a masterpiece. When they stepped out of the Rolls Royce at the Civic Center, Obinna Ekwueme didn't just hold his wife's hand, he possessed it. His grip was firm, his dark eyes scanning the crowd like the lion of Lagos she was known to be, daring anyone to look at her for a second too long. To the world, it looked like devotion. To Adanna, it felt like a security detail. 2 years, 730 nights. That was how long she had been Mrs. Ekwueme, and that was exactly how long she had slept alone in the master suite of the Zenith. Inside the glass walls of their Eko Atlantic penthouse, the humid heat of Lagos was murdered by aggressive air conditioning. The air always smelt the same: expensive wood, chilled leather, and silence. Adanna sat on the edge of the sprawling sofa, watching her husband stand by the floor-to-ceiling window. He was a towering silhouette in a crisp white senator suit, staring out at the ocean he had conquered, looking like an unmovable mountain. He had given her everything he promised on their wedding night: the black card, the protection, the envy of every woman on the island. Everything, except the one thing that made a marriage real. He hadn't touched her, not once, not since the ink dried on the certificate. "You're staring," Obina said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated through the freezing room. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He was a man who sensed everything in his territory. "I'm just wondering," Adanna replied, her voice soft but laced with a new dangerous fatigue, "if you bought this penthouse to live in it or just to store your things." He finally turned. His eyes were dark, hooded, and empty of anything she could hold on to. "Go to bed, Adanna." The dismissal was polite, clinical, final. She looked at his large calloused hands that built skyscrapers but refused to hold her wife, and realized the silence wasn't just quiet anymore, it was suffocating. She didn't just need a hobby, she needed a heartbeat in this mausoleum. If he wouldn't make a sound, she decided, she would find someone who could. That was the night she emailed the music academy. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just hiring a piano teacher. She was lighting a match inside a room full of gasoline.
The sun rose over Eko Atlantic, but inside the zenith, the light felt filtered, sanitized. Adanna stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the Atlantic Ocean crash against the Great Wall of Lagos. It was a violent, chaotic collision of water and stone, yet, through 3 inches of bulletproof glass, it was utterly mute. That was the defining feature of her marriage: high definition, expensive, and completely silent. Behind her, the house routine unfolded with military precision. House staff moved like ghosts across the marble floors, placing covered dishes on the obsidian dining table. Obina was already seated at the head, a dark anchor in the pristine room. He wore a charcoal suit today, the fabric absorbing the room's artificial chill, his attention fixed entirely on the tablet in his large, scarred hand. "The driver will take you to the island for the foundation meeting at noon," he said. He didn't look up. It wasn't a conversation, it was a briefing. "And after?" Adanna asked, taking her seat. She didn't eat. She rarely had an appetite in this house. "After, you return here. It's not safe on the mainland today. There are protests near the bridge." Adanna nodded, stirring her tea just to hear the spoon chime against the china. This was the pact. She was the ornament, the soft public face to his hard private power. Her friends called her lucky. They saw the chauffeur, the platinum cards, the trips to Dubai. They didn't see the golden handcuffs. They didn't know that gold was a heavy metal, cold to the touch and impossible to break. She was a curator of a life she wasn't allowed to live. Obina stood up, checking his watch. He walked over to her, leaning down. For a fleeting, foolish second, her breath hitched, wondering if today he would bridge the gap. Instead, he placed a hand on the back of her chair, never her skin, and leaned in close enough for her to smell the sharp scent of his cologne. "Be safe, Adanna," he murmured. Then he turned and walked out, the heavy thud of the front door sealing the fortress. The silence rushed back in, immediate and suffocating. It rang in her ears. She looked around the living room, her eyes landing on the Steinway grand piano in the corner. It was a wedding gift from him, polished black and breathless, bought solely for aesthetic symmetry. It had never been played. Adanna pulled out her phone, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs. Obina hated unpredictability. He hated strangers in his sanctuary, but the silence was killing her faster than any danger on the mainland could. She navigated to the website for the Lagos Conservatory and typed a message quickly before her training could stop her. "I need a teacher, not for a beginner. I need someone who understands jazz, someone who isn't afraid of the quiet." She hit send, and for the first time in 2 years, the air in the room felt breathable. Tayo Balogun didn't belong in the zenith. He was a creature of the mainland, sun-warm skin, a wrinkled beige linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and worn leather sandals that slapped softly against the marble foyer. When the private elevator opened, he seemed to bring the scent of humid Lagos rain and traffic exhaust into the sterile, refrigerated air of the penthouse. Adanna stood by the Steinway, spine rigid, armored in a structured sage green dress. She was prepared for a formal instructor, someone who would treat her like the fragile porcelain doll Obina insisted she was. Tayo just smiled, his eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at the ocean view or the priceless art. He looked at her. "Relax, Mrs. Ekwueme," he said, his voice light, unburdened by the gravity of the room. He walked to the piano and ran a hand over the lid. "The instrument doesn't bite. I've heard the owner might, but the keys are safe." Adanna blinked, caught off guard. I haven't played in years." "Good," Tayo said, sitting on the bench and patting the empty space beside him. "Sit." Miles away, on the 45th floor of Ekwueme Holdings, the boardroom was empty. Obina sat alone at the head of the long mahogany table, the city skyline sprawling beneath him. He should have been reviewing the Lekki deep-sea port contracts. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the iPad propped against his crystal water glass. The security feed was high definition, crisp, and merciless. He watched the stranger sit on his bench. He watched his slender, artistic hands hover over the keys, hands that looked nothing like Obina's own heavy, scarred fists. Tayo leaned in to adjust Adanna's wrist, his fingers brushing her skin with a casual familiarity that made the air in the boardroom drop 10 degrees. Obina's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his beard. The distance between them on the bench was professional, yet to Obina it looked like an invasion. Then the audio feed crackled. No, don't fight the rhythm. Let it flow, like traffic at 2 a.m., free." Adanna missed a note. Tayo whispered a joke she couldn't quite catch, and then it happened. Adanna threw her head back. Her shoulders, usually held high with the crushing weight of her duty, dropped. A sound erupted from her throat, deep, genuine, and unguarded. A laugh. Obina froze, his hand, resting on the table, curled into a fist so tight his knuckles turned gray. He knew that laugh. It was the sound of the girl he had met 3 years ago, before the marriage, before the pact, before he had silenced her to keep her safe. He had spent 2 years ensuring she was protected, composed, and untouched, and in 20 minutes, a stranger in wrinkled linen had unlocked her. Obina swiped the screen off, the glass of the tablet cracking under the sudden violent pressure of his thumb. The screen went black, but the sound of her laughter echoed in the silence, mocking his control. The private elevator arrived without a sound, sliding open to deposit Obina into his own foyer 3 hours ahead of schedule. He stepped onto the marble, loosening his tie with one hand, expecting the usual mausoleum silence. Instead, he walked into a room that felt completely foreign. The air wasn't cold, it was charged. A melody drifted from the living room, jazz, messy and improvisational, utterly unlike the rigid classical pieces he had expected. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. Adanna and the teacher were at the piano. They were framed by the panoramic window, the setting sun casting long, golden shadows across the room. But Obina didn't see the sunset. He saw the space between them, or rather, the lack of it. Tayo sat on the edge of the bench, his body angled toward Adanna. His knee was inches from her thigh. He was laughing at something she had said, his head thrown back, his neck exposed. Adanna was smiling, a soft, private smile that Obina hadn't earned in 2 years. "I think you are improvising now, Mrs. Ekwueme," Tayo teased, his voice carrying easily. "I'm trying to find the rhythm," she replied, her voice light. "You have it. You just need to—" "To what?" Obina asked. The words were spoken at a normal volume, but they landed like stones dropped in still water. The music died instantly. Adanna's spine snapped straight. Tayo turned, the smile fading from his face as he took in the man looming at the entrance of the room. Obina walked forward, his movement slow, deliberate, eating up the space until he stood directly beside the piano bench. He towered over the seated teacher. In his dark, bespoke suit, Obina looked like a storm, clouding hovering over a picnic. He stared down at Tayo, his heavy-lidded eyes devoid of light. "Obina Mr. Balogun," Obina said. The name rolled off his tongue with terrifying precision. "You are comfortable." Tayo stood up immediately. He was tall, but Obina was a mountain. The size difference was visceral. "Mr. Ekwueme, we were just finishing a scale. Your wife has a natural ear." "Does she?" Obina's eyes flicked to Adanna, burning with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He looked back at Tayo, his eyes dropping to the man's hands, slender, artistic, unscarred, that were currently resting on the piano lid. "You sit very close for a piano lesson. I was under the impression the instrument required space." "Technique requires proximity, sir," Tayo said, holding his ground, though his Adam's apple bobbed. "Proximity," Obina repeated, testing the word like it was a weapon. He took a step closer to Tayo, invading his personal space with casual arrogance. "In this house, Mr. Balogun, proximity is a privilege. Do not mistake my hospitality for an invitation." The threat was silent, buried under layers of etiquette, but it was deafening. Tayo blinked, sensing the violence coiling beneath the billionaire's expensive suit. "I think that's enough for today," Adanna said, her voice trembling slightly, as she stood up, effectively placing herself between the two men. Obina didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Tayo for 3 heartbeats too long before finally stepping back. "My driver will see you out, now." As Tayo gathered his things and retreated toward the elevator, Obina turned to his wife. Adanna looked up at him, expecting the cold indifference she had lived with for 700 days. But the mask had slipped. His jaw was clenched so hard a vein throbbed at his temple, and his eyes weren't dead anymore. They were blazing with a dark, terrifying heat. It wasn't just anger, it was possession. For the first time, the lion looked like he was ready to tear the bars off the cage. The grand banquet hall of the Civic Center on Victoria Island was a kaleidoscope of diamonds, heavy George lace, and political ambition. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the collective body heat of Lagos's 1%. Adanna moved through the crowd in a floor-length gold gown that shimmered like liquid money, her arm looped around Obina's. To the room, they were royalty, but Adanna knew the truth. She was merely the crown jewel Obina wore to prove his kingdom was stable. "Obina, my man!" Senator Adebayo boomed, clapping a heavy hand on Obina's shoulder. "And the lovely Mrs. Ekwueme, you two make the rest of us look like amateurs. 2 years and still looking like newlyweds." Obina smiled, a practiced, razor-sharp expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Maintenance is key, Senator, in business and in life." As the senator laughed,
Obina shifted. His large hand, which had been hovering near her elbow, slid firmly around her waist, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress, a possessive, territorial claim, fueled by the lingering memory of the piano teacher in his home. He wasn't holding her, he was branding her. The heat of his palm burned through the fabric, searing her skin. It was the most contact they had shared in months, and the hypocrisy of it made Adanna's stomach turn. She leaned in close, rising on her tiptoes under the pretense of whispering an endearment. He felt his body tense, hard as granite against her softness. "Why?" she whispered, her breath ghosting over his ear. Obina didn't look down. He kept his gaze fixed on the room, scanning for threats. "Why what?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Why do you only touch me when they are watching?" she hissed, the words laced with a quiet, trembling fury. His grip on her waist tightened to the point of pain. For a second, the facade cracked. He looked down at her, his dark eyes swirling with a mixture of warning and something dangerously close to hunger. "Be quiet, Adanna," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "We are on stage." "I'm tired of the performance," she replied, pulling away just an inch, enough to show resistance, but not enough to cause a scene. Across the room, standing in the shadow of a pillar, a man with a jagged scar running down his neck swelled a glass of champagne. He wasn't looking at the senator or the diamond, he was watching the Ekwuemes. He saw the way Adanna pulled away, he saw the tension in Obina's jaw, he saw the crack in the unmovable mountain. "Trouble in paradise," the man whispered to himself, taking a slow sip. He pulled out his phone and typed a single message to his boss. "The lion is distracted. The gate is open."
The envelope arrived at his office on the 45th floor, bypassing 3 layers of security. It was plain, white, and innocuous. Obina sliced it open with a gold letter opener, expecting a subpoena or a bribe. Inside, there was a single photograph. It was grainy, taken with a high-powered lens from a neighboring tower or a drone. It showed the interior of the penthouse, his sanctuary. In the frame, Adanna sat at the piano, her head thrown back in laughter, while Tayo Balogun stood over her, his hand resting on the piano lead, inches from hers. On the back, written in elegant cursive script, was a simple message. "The walls are glass, Obina. Even the lion sleeps." The air in the office seemed to vanish. Obina didn't shout. He didn't slam the desk. He went completely, terrifyingly still. The threat was precise. They weren't just watching him. They were watching the one thing he had left unguarded. They had identified the crack in his armor, the music, the laughter, the teacher. 30 minutes later, the private elevator doors slid open at the zenith. Obina didn't walk in, he invaded the space. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted instantly, the pressure dropping as if a storm had breached the walls. Adanna was in the living room, arranging flowers. She looked up, startled by his midday appearance. "Obina, is something—" "Pack the piano," he said. His voice was low, flat, and brooked no argument. He walked past her to the intercom panel on the wall. "What?" Adanna dropped a stem of orchids. "What are you talking about?" "I said pack it up or burn it. I don't care." He pressed the button for the concierge. "This is Mr. Ekwueme. Tayo Balogun is denied entry effective immediately. If he steps foot in the lobby, break his legs." He released the button and turned to his wife. Adanna was staring at him, her face pale, her hands trembling. "You can't do that, Obina. You can't just—" "It is done." Obina cut her off, closing the distance between them. He loomed over her, radiating a heat that was equal parts rage and terror. "You are not to leave this apartment, Adanna. Not for the foundation, not for the market, not for church. You stay behind the glass where I can see you." "I am what, a prisoner, Obina?" "You are whatever I need you to be to keep you alive," he roared, the control finally snapping. The sound bounced off the cold walls. "The lessons are over. The music is over. I gave you an inch and you let the world inside. He grabbed her shoulders hard. It wasn't an embrace, it was a containment. From now on, the doors stay locked. No one comes in, especially not him. Adanna looked into his eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't doing this because he hated the music. He was doing it because he was terrified. But as his fingers dug into her skin, she realized that his fear was far more dangerous to her freedom than any enemy outside. "You aren't saving me, Obina," she said, her voice shaking. "You are burying me. I will not live in a mausoleum, Obina." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the recycled air of the penthouse like a diamond cutter. Obina stood by the wet bar, his back to her, pouring a glass of whiskey with a hand that shook ever so slightly. "You will live where you are safe," he replied, downing the drink in one burn. "The decision is made." "Safe?" Adanna laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. "You think this is safety? Walking on eggshells for 2 years? Sleeping in a bed that feels like a tomb? That is not safety, Obina. That is just a slower way to die." He turned then, the crystal glass slamming on the marble counter with a violence that threatened to shatter it. "You can't lecture me on survival, Adanna. You grew up in a palace of death. I grew up cleaning blood off the pavement. I know what it takes to keep a thing whole." "You aren't keeping us whole. You are keeping us empty." She took a step forward, closing the distance he had so carefully maintained. "You are so terrified of becoming your father that you have become a ghost instead." The air left the room. Obina went perfectly, terrifyingly still. His eyes narrowed into slits, the darkness in them swelling. "Do not speak of him." "Why? Because he lost everything for a woman?" She pushed closer, entering his personal space. The heat radiating off him was immense, like standing next to a furnace door. "You think if you don't touch me, you won't lose me," she softly whispered, her eyes illuminated. "But Obina, look at me. You are losing me right now." He stared down at her, the obsidian darkness of his eyes fracturing. The wall was still there, but for the first time in 2 years, Adanna was standing on the other side of it. Her hand against his face was the final fracture. The last wall of the fortress didn't crumble slowly. It exploded. Obina caught her wrist. His grip was wide, encompassing her entire forearm, but for the first time, there was no restraint. He pulled her hand from his face and pressed her palm against the center of his chest, right over the violent, thundering drum of his heart. "You think this is indifference?" he rasped, his voice dropping into the low, guttural cadence of his native Igbo. "Ina-eche na onwe ihe gbasara mi." "Then tell me." Adanna breathed, her pulse fluttering against his chest. "Tell me why you starve us." Obina stepped in, collapsing the remaining air between them. He looked down at her, his eyes stripping away the last 2 years of pretense. "Because I know what I am," he said, the words tearing out of him. "My father destroyed his world because he could not separate his heart from his head. I swore I would never be that weak." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, heavy and feverish. "I didn't stay away because I didn't want you, Adanna. I stayed away because I wanted you too much. I knew if I crossed this line, if I finally let myself have you, I would burn the world down just to keep you." "Then burn it," she whispered. The permission was the spark. Obina made a sound deep in his throat, a growl of surrender, and crashed his mouth onto hers. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was a collision. It was 2 years of hunger, rage, and silence detonating all at once. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, his hands tangling in her hair, ruining the perfect pins, dragging her head back to deepen the angle. Adanna didn't pull away. She melted into him, She wrapped her arms around his massive shoulders, anchoring herself as he swept her up into his arms effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing. He carried her down the hall, kicking open the door to the master bedroom, the room she had walked past like a ghost for 700 nights. He didn't turn on the lights. The glow of the Lagos skyline bled through the sheer curtains, painting their skin in silver and shadow. When he laid her on the pristine, untouched sheets, he followed her down immediately, his heavy body covering her, shielding her, claiming her. "Mine," he murmured against her throat, his voice rough with need. No more pacts, no more silence. There was no Lion of Lagos in that bed. There was only a man who had been starving, finally feasting on the only thing that could sustain him. When they finally came together, the friction was honest, stripped of all armor. The glass fortress didn't shatter. It simply ceased to matter. The only reality was the heat of his skin against hers and the way he whispered her name like a prayer he had been afraid to speak aloud. The sun did not apologize for entering the room today. It flooded the master suite of the zenith, turning the dust motes into suspended gold. Adanna woke slowly, her body heavy and aching in a way that felt like victory. The space beside her was empty, but the sheets were still warm, indented with the heavy memory of his weight. She sat up, pulling the duvet against her chest. Obina was standing by the mahogany dresser, fastening the gold cufflinks of a fresh navy suit. He was back in his armor, every line sharp and immaculate, but the energy in the room had shifted. The desperate, vibrating tension that usually radiated off him was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly grounded calm. He caught her eyes in the mirror. He didn't look away. He turned, walking back to the bed to sit on the edge. The mattress dipped under him. "Sleep," he murmured, his thumb brushing her lower lip, tracing the swelling there. "You're leaving," she said, her voice raspy. "I have business to conclude." The phone on the nightstand buzzed. It vibrated against the wood like a trapped insect. Unknown caller. Adanna stiffened, the memory of the threat rushing back. Obina saw the fear flicker in her eyes. He didn't grab the phone and leave the room to hide the darkness from her. He picked it up and answered it, speakerphone off, his eyes locked on her wife. "Ekwueme." The voice on the other end was tinny, leaking slightly into the quiet room. "You are careless, Lion. We see you inside. We see the weakness." Obina didn't flinch. He didn't look at the window or check the locks. He looked at Adanna's bare shoulders, at the mark his mouth had left on the curve of her neck, and realized with brutal clarity that the voice was wrong. He hadn't exposed a flank. He had secured his base. "You are mistaken," Obina said, his voice dropping to a register so low it felt like the rumble of an earthquake. "She does not make me soft. She gives me a reason to be violent." There was a stunned silence on the line. "Come for the house," Obina continued, his tone conversational, lethal. "I beg you, come. I have been looking for an excuse to remind Lagos who owns the ground it stands on." He hung up without waiting for a response and tossed the phone on the duvet. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with steady hands. "I will be home for dinner, Adanna. Wait for me." It wasn't a request. It was a promise. He turned and walked out of the room, not like a man afraid of what he might lose, but like a king going to slaughter anyone who dared to touch what was his. The zenith was still a fortress of glass and steel, towering above the chaos of Lagos. But the air inside no longer tasted of sterile silence. It smelled of jollof rice simmering in the kitchen and the rich woody scent of the Steinway being played, not just looked at. Adanna sat at the keys, her fingers moving with a fluid, practiced ease. She wasn't playing classical drills anymore. She was playing jazz, a slow, sultry rendition of Fela that filled the cavernous living room with life. She wore a silk robe, loosely tied, her hair free from its pins. The perfect frozen statue was gone. The woman remained. She didn't stop playing when the private elevator chimed. She didn't flinch when heavy footsteps crossed the marble floor. In the past, his arrival would have sucked the oxygen out of the room. Now, it just added gravity. Obina appeared in her periphery. He had discarded his jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal the thick forearms that built an empire. He didn't stand in the doorway watching her like a guard dog. He moved directly to her. He stepped behind the bench, his large warm hands sliding instantly onto her shoulders. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need to. He needed the tension from her neck, his thumbs pressing into her skin with a possessive familiarity. "You are late," Adanna said, her voice teasing, weaving through the melody she was playing. "The pot expansion," Obina murmured, bending down to press a kiss to the curve of her neck, right where her pulse beat steady and strong. "They think because I am married, I have lost my teeth. I had to remind them." Adanna smiled, leaning back into him, her fingers finally stealing on the keys. "Did they survive the reminder?" "Barely." He rounded the bench and sat beside her, the wood groaning slightly under his weight. He took her hand, the one that had once trembled, to touch his scar, and interlaced their fingers. The contact was grounding, a closed circuit of power. They looked out at the skyline of Eko Atlantic, the city lights flickering like diamonds spilled on black velvet. The world outside was still dangerous, the cartels were still hungry, and the rumors still swirled. But the glass between them and the world wasn't there to keep Adanna in anymore. It was there to keep the rest of the world out. "They used to say the lion walks alone," Adanna whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. Obina brought her knuckles to his lips, his dark eyes watching the reflection of his wife in the glass. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "They don't know that the pride is stronger than the lion." He didn't let go of her hand. In the heart of the fortress, the music had ended, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full.